Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, and a warm welcome to our audience and panelists today at today's Bruegel event on the topic of Carbon Club versus Climate Alliance, which way forward for multilateral climate and trade governance. My name is David Kleiman. I'm a visiting fellow here at Bruegel, working on climate and trade issues, and I'm very much delighted that Bruegel is hosting this discussion at this pivotal moment in time. Today is a very special day for all those interested in the intersection of climate and trade governance. Very early this morning, negotiators from the European Commission, the European Parliament, and the Council have come to an agreement on the world's first carbon border adjustment mechanism that will mirror the EU's domestic carbon price at the EU customs border to prevent carbon leakage. This really is a historical achievement, and before moving on to the substance of our discussion today, I would like to take this opportunity to congratulate all those involved in this hard piece of work, whether in government, parliament, civil society, NGOs, industries concerned, to the agreement in principle on this much anticipated piece of legislation that was reached this morning. Moving from EU internal to international cooperation on climate change mitigation, industrial decarbonization, and carbon leakage prevention, today's discussion aims at contrasting two approaches to set international cooperation, and that is, first, the notion of an exclusive climate club as was originally proposed by the famous William Nordhaus in the 1990s, and that reincarnated in form of a rather recent US policy proposal, notably in the shape of the US demand for a global steel and aluminum arrangement made in context of US-EU negotiations over the removal of US Section 232 national security tariffs that were, just by the way, found to violate WTO rules 2 days ago. On the other end, we would like to discuss the German G7 Presidency's proposal for an inclusive cooperative climate club, or what others have called and labeled a climate alliance or a cooperation platform. Over the last year, we've seen many debates, papers, and discussions deliberating the advantages and disadvantages of the one approach and the other. It appears, however, that this debate is here to stay with us in 2023. Yesterday, for instance, the German G7 Presidency has released the terms of references for her proposal of an inclusive and cooperative climate alliance detailing substance, process, and institutional affiliation of the new cooperation platform. And meanwhile, last week, the US Trade Representative's Office submitted a concept paper to the European Commission's Directorate General for Trade, detailing membership criteria for its proposed exclusive sectoral steel and aluminum club that allegedly aims to address carbon intensity and to restore market orientation in the sector. Against this background, there is certainly no shortage of difficult and unresolved questions and issues to discuss today, but we're lucky enough to have 4 stellar panelists with us who will enlighten us about the stakes and prospects of the 2 respective proposals. And indeed, we're delighted to have with us Dr. Steffen Meyer, Director General for Economic, Financial, and Climate Policy at the German Federal Chancellery. Roberta Pierfederici is a policy analyst at LSE's Grantham Institute and co-author of the G7 commissioned report on the said climate club proposal. Professor Kasturi Das at the Institute for Management and Technology in Delhi, and well-known capacity on all issues at the intersection of climate and trade governance. And last but not least, Professor Aaron Cosby at the International Institute for Sustainable Development and the European Roundtable for Climate and Change and Sustainable Transition. Thank you all for being with us in the first place. We are proceeding for now as follows. We will start with the first round of comments on the inclusive G7 Climate Club proposal, and will, after discussion, turn to a second round of comments on the exclusive sectoral climate club proposal put forward by the United States in the context of 232 tariff negotiations. A final note to the audience, if I may, before we turn to our first speaker, Dr. Meyer, who just arrived with us. So we're very grateful that you could make it. If to the audience, if you wish to submit questions or comments disguised as questions, please do so via the Slido app on the Bruegel website, on the event website, and we will do our best to give voice to these questions and comments during and at the end of our discussion. But now, without further ado, let me turn to our first speaker, Dr. Stefan Meyer. The floor is yours.
David, thank you very much, and I hope you can hear me very good. Well, thank you very much for the invitation. It's an honor to speak here and having the opportunity to speak about the Climate Club, because as you indicated, yesterday was a very good day as G7 leaders decided to establish the Climate Club. This was one of our central deliverables from the G7 summit in Elmau. I think it's important to start with mentioning that the Climate Club is not supposed to be any exclusive G7 initiative, but rather seek support on a global scale. This will not be a sprint, but a marathon, very clearly. So far, we've received a lot of encouragement from international partners beyond the G7, with whom we will work closely and continue to further develop the Climate Club. The Climate Club makes an important contribution to achieving the Paris Agreement climate goals, where the world is unfortunately off track at the moment, with climate targets tabled by all countries. We're on a path more towards a 2.7 degrees Celsius world by the end of the century, with severe implications for our security, our well-being, and the world economy. We need to make the 2020s the decade of transformation. Carbon dioxide emissions need to peak as soon as possible and to be reduced almost by half until 2030 to keep the 1.5 Celsius global warming limit in reach. Looking at the transformation of our industries, we see promising developments, but still too slow to embark a 1.5 degree emission reduction pathway. We face, and that's the central point for the Climate Club, we face a collective action problem. When it comes to effective climate policy addressing trade-intensive sectors, governments are worried that industrial production will move to countries with lower ambition level. We can only escape the dilemma by working closer together, and that's the Climate Club, by intensifying international cooperation on the next industrial revolution. The Climate Club will be open to all countries that are committed to a swift implementation of the Paris Agreement and that are willing to work towards joint action to drive the decarbonization of our industries. Real quick, there are three pillars to the club. Pillar one is advancing ambitious and transparent climate change mitigation policies. Advanced ambition and transparent climate mitigation policies on the pathways towards climate neutrality. We want to share best practices, ensure comparability, and a higher degree of compatibility of policies of club members. A higher degree of policy alignment will also reduce risks of trade frictions due to unilateral measures. The second pillar is transforming industries. The goal is to agree on joint standards and possibly also sectoral strategies and milestones on industrial decarbonization. We want to develop, for example, common definitions for green materials, as well as standards of public procurement and joint R&D priorities. The result will be a major push for expanding lead markets for green industrial products. And finally, the third pillar, boosting international climate cooperation and partnerships. Countries face different circumstances in decarbonizing and developing their industries. We want to support especially developing and emerging economies in really leapfrogging into climate-friendly industrial development. Climate Club aims to mobilize investments through sectoral and technical cooperation. Just energy transition partnerships are one very good example. They will also contribute to this pillar by accelerating transition to climate-friendly energy system. I stop here, look forward to the discussion.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meyer. And we've been told that you are just coming from the Chancellor's office. We are so grateful that you still could find time to be with us in any case. If I may, thank you so much for this concise comments. The terms of reference, if I may just ask one or two follow-up questions, say there will be a task force led by the German Chancellery. There will be an institutional affiliation. Could you tell us a little bit about the process going forward in terms of institutional affiliation and how this will be carried into the next G7 presidency and how perhaps the G20 group has reacted to the proposal? Yeah.
So I think first we now have those terms of references. One important element is we will have a secretariat. This secretariat will be the OECD in tandem with the International Energy Agency. So to say, very importantly, building on the two pillars that we have, the comparability, that's more the OECD side, the transformational part, all the information coming from the IEA. So that should be very helpful in moving the climate club forward. What is clear is those terms of reference are terms of reference for now. As we are open to new members, this will be a dynamic process in which we are open to bring in new members to further discuss how to further develop as well the terms of references. And the interim secretary should be helpful in that regard. Among other tasks, liaise with relevant international organizations, World Bank, IMF, and others, and ensure synergies and avoid duplication of efforts with many other initiatives. And we, in the second part, come to one initiative where this will show for the first time. In terms of the Japanese G7 presidency, but also the upcoming G20 presidency, we think that many of the topics picked up there are quite consistent with what we want to do with the Climate Club. And the idea would be to, of course, move it into the G20, reach out to G20 countries, but importantly, reach out over and above those countries, as this is supposed to be really a global effort.
Thank you so much. That has given us a great start and showed us the landscape of in terms of substance and prospects going forward. Roberta Pierferici, you have been asked by the G7 presidency to there was a report that was commissioned to the LSE Grantham Institute to flesh out a little bit the idea of an inclusive and cooperative climate club. And I had the joy of reading it, can recommend the literature to everyone. Could you perhaps outline a bit, I know it's only 5 minutes, but the findings that you've come to and do they match what we've just heard?
Yeah, thanks, David, for inviting me to this important and extremely timely discussion. So, as you said, the Grantham Research Institute at the London School of Economics has been commissioned by the German G7 Presidency to prepare an independent report with the goal of providing recommendations on the principles and design features of the Climate Club. And this report was presented on the 12th of October at the G7 Finance Ministers and Central Bank Governors meeting in Washington, and is publicly released. So we are actually glad to see that some of our recommendations have been taken on board in the recently released terms of reference. At the same time, we noticed that the current terms of reference is not completely fully aligned with our advices, and I'm going to just sketch out a little bit of those differences. So in terms of the key recommendations that we included in our report, we see the Climate Club as an intergovernmental and inclusive arrangement that is consistent with international rules, including trade rules, with the goal of bringing countries together to accelerate action on climate change. And I think that the main message of our report is that The Climate Club, if well designed, can make an important contribution to strengthening international climate commitments. But in order to be successful, it needs to follow some key principles. And we define those key principles in the report. So first of all, we think that the club must be designed and framed as part of a positive narrative around sustainable economic growth and development. And in this respect, we think that the club should really push forward action on investment, innovation, and finance. It must also have a membership that is both ambitious in terms of climate commitments, but also inclusive. And in this respect, we think that it's not sufficient that the club is open. Instead, we think that it's absolutely crucial that the large emerging and developing countries are included in the club since the very beginning as inaugural members. And in this respect, the club should be very inclusive from the very start, with countries from the global south being able to co-design and co-lead the club and also be part of the initial interim secretariat. And we think that this is necessary to create the required critical mass that can really drive change. We also think that the club must recognize and accept that countries will implement different policy mixes, including both price-based and non-price-based policies. And in the report, we also state that it's not realistic to aim for a club with a common carbon price regime or a common carbon border adjustment mechanism. And when we talk about inclusiveness, we also wonder whether the club label is appropriate or if we should find another terminology, as the term club in itself might sound a bit exclusive. We also claim that the club should observe WTO rules, should reflect members' different starting positions in line with the principle of common but differentiated responsibility, and this is very important for including emerging and developing economies. And he also must aim to support the Paris Agreement process rather than replacing it. And in this respect, we aim for the club to support existing initiatives under the Paris umbrella without creating parallel tracks. And we propose to organize the club in working groups following 3 different pillars that also reflect the different motivations that countries might have to join the club itself. As the first pillar, we identify the partnership pillar, which is about providing finance and technical assistance to developing countries, as well as creating technology transfer vehicles and mobilizing private finance channels. The second pillar is about managing policy diversity, so as to address concerns about carbon leakage and competitiveness and trade-related action. And in this respect, we see the club as a forum for agreeing on principle and monitoring climate-related border measures as well, directly or through the WTO fora, and share best practices for addressing trade frictions. The third pillar is about sectoral alignment, and we see it as focus on accelerating the decarbonization of high emission sectors, agreeing on decarbonization pathways, collective support for defining common standards, emission measurements, and also foster innovation. And in terms of the output of the club, we see it mostly as process improvements rather than treaties. For instance, by agreeing to adopt sectoral carbon pathways, or perhaps set up and support country cooperation on platforms such as the Just Energy Transition Pathways to enable transformational growth. So I'll stop here, and I'm happy to provide more details and also to highlight what other additional improvements we might see in terms of the current terms of reference that the G7 just released yesterday.
Thank you so much, Roberta Pierfederici. This it sounds very ambitious indeed, and there seems to be a the one focus and particular attention that is given here is really to generate legitimacy and to recognize diversity. At the same time, like if we look at the exclusiveness of the other proposal, there seems to be more of a focus on incentives to join and membership criteria. We seem to be, both wanting to square the circle, being ambitious and both inclusive. What are the incentives to join, and what are the is there a particular incentive scheme that makes this forum attractive for nations to join?
Thanks, David. So the three pillars that we identify are somehow defining the main motivations for countries to join. So the first one we think is quite actually central to our proposal because it's about creating a strong motivation for emerging and developing countries to be part of the Climate Club. And this is absolutely essential for the club to be successful and create the critical mass. So in this respect, we think that the partnership pillar that is supposed to be about providing finance, technology transfer, but also capacity building and filling the finance gap. This would be the main motivation for critical emerging and developing countries to join. For other countries that are advancing already forward in terms of climate ambition, a motivation to join might be to find solutions for trade frictions that might arise given the difference in ambition that countries might face. And finally, there is, I think, a joint global interest in being member of the Climate Club in terms of fostering innovation, measurements, creating green markets, agreeing on definitions of standards to really push forward decarbonization, especially in the industrial sector. So I think this is a very important motivation that is kind of crossover all the different members that might decide to join.
Thank you so much about that. And if you don't mind, I know everyone else is patiently waiting. If I have one more question, because we're seeing a lot of discussion about subsidies these days, also in light of the IRA, the Inflation Reduction Act, and the need to cooperate at the EU-US level, and others, South Korea and Japan have also voiced concerns. There seems to be a growing momentum to cooperate and to sort of diffuse tensions in regard of subsidies for decarbonization and energy subsidies. My question is basically, you have one element in your proposal that addresses subsidies. Is this Climate Club proposal as envisaged in your report? Is that a forum that could address subsidies or create a forum for subsidies negotiations?
So, as I said, we don't see the Climate Club to replace existing initiatives or international fora. We see it mostly as a forum for fostering discussion and agreements within the existing initiatives and international fora. So in terms of the legitimacy of specific subsidies, the role that the Climate Club could play is actually to put countries together to actively discuss within also the WTO umbrella, because that is the actual fora where this type of incentives needs to be discussed. So we don't see it as replacing WTO rules or WTO discussion, rather as a forum where countries can come together also with the WTO to address those issues.
Thank you so much, Dr. Meyer. You're nodding in confirmation. Do you see a space for subsidies discussion to take place in the proposed Climate Club?
Well, let me say that I can agree with almost everything Roberta has explained. I think it shows that we've been in touch quite a bit over the last couple of months in further developing the idea of the climate club. I think on the question of subsidies, it's exactly as Roberta said. This will not be a forum in which you would try to replace other institutions. What you want to do is have a forum of ambitious countries that want to move forward, and you give a forum where you can actually discuss and you build trust and confidence and you develop solutions. There is a lot of technical work necessary, for example, to make comparable different paths to climate neutrality, one way more with regulation, maybe subsidies, another more with a explicit carbon price. And you want to understand better what it means so that you move in the direction of a level playing field, so that you can actually send your companies on the path towards climate neutrality with new technologies. So that's a very important element. I wanted to say one sentence. The club sounds exclusive. I think if you look at the terms of reference, it shows that it's an open, cooperative, and inclusive forum. So I think that kind of discussion should be behind us at some point. It was actually quite helpful with some countries who complained about the name to start engaging in a discussion, and then after 1 or 2 rounds, they understand much better.
Great. Thank you so much. Speaking of club versus alliance, it's certainly not meant to be a club of G7 countries. Professor Das, there's of course the Indian elephant in the room, in that, you know, we have a G20 forum that is to some extent has China and India that will have a view on this. What is the perspective from India?
Good afternoon, good evening, good morning, wherever you are. First of all, thanks to David and all the organizers for having me here in this very interesting time. In the interest of time, let me go to. I don't have any slides or something prepared, but what I would like to do is to respond to some of the issues which have already been raised. And of course, I was going through the documents recently released. First of all, I would like to mention that I am not representing government of India here, because I don't work for the government. But yes, of course, I am in touch with various stakeholders, and we have been discussing in different forums these issues. So certainly I can share certain views that are coming up during the course of the discussion. So one thing I would like to start with is regarding the nomenclature. As Mr. Mayor has already pointed out, that there has been some discussion about whether it is climate club or whether it is more cooperative and inclusive, and I think Robert also mentioned about it. So what is not clear here is why then it is necessary to have this nomenclature of climate club and not climate alliance. That is my first question that I would like to put forward. The reason is that the climate club, this notion, as you pointed out, David, at the very beginning, is associated with this approach that came from Nordhaus, the famous economist. And it of course, recently you can see that there are different ways in which the terminology has been used. But having said that, climate club itself originally looks like more exclusive on the one hand, and also if it is a club, then there has to be certain conditionalities for entry, as well as if you are not entering, then there has to be some kind of punitive action or some kind of penalty for not joining. So these are some of the criteria of a club, and traditionally these are associated with the concept of club. So to my mind, if the focus is more on cooperative and inclusive and open arrangement, the club terminology may not send the right signal, to my mind. This is entirely my personal view. I would like to respond to some other points that Roberta mentioned. One point which is very important to my mind is that looking at different measures undertaken by countries. And Robert mentioned that it should not be looked at only pricing measures, but also non-price measures. And to my mind, it is very important for having a more inclusive approach that this kind of flexibility is maintained, because whatever a country might be doing, it is often depending on the context of that country. And when I say context, it is not only about what kind of capability it has got, but is also about whether they are in a position to implement certain specific kind of measures, say carbon pricing directly, or whether they are in a better position to go for approaches which are not exactly directly carbon pricing or cap and trade, but still may actually lead later on to those kinds of approaches, and to begin with may also help in addressing the climate mitigation related issues. So that way, I think it is important to maintain that kind of flexibility. Another point Roberta was mentioning was about incentive, why other countries will have incentive to join. And she mentioned about investment finance and innovation and also technology transfer. I think these are very, very important. Having said that, let me talk about finance. And we know that under the Paris Agreement, and before that also there were some promises being made regarding finance, and those I don't think have been met. So that has created some kind of mistrust regarding how far some countries are really serious about providing any kind of financial support, and whether it would be addition to what is already committed elsewhere, maybe ODA or something like that. So that is, there is a mistrust regarding finance. That is one point. And if you look at the need for finance, and if you look at some of the studies that have been done only for India, you need trillions and trillions of dollars to finance that kind of decarbonization. If you talk about industry, if you talk about transportation, if you talk about other kinds of, how you have more renewable in place, etc., etc. And if you are talking about in emerging economies or developing countries as a whole, then it's a huge, list of countries, and the need for finance is that much. So I'm not sure how far it is possible to actually address finance to that extent. I'm just raising this. And regarding technology transfer and innovation, again, very, very important. And these are issues which have been non-starter under the multilateral discussion also. So if something, relevant and more positive can be undertaken under this club initiative, I think that would be a very good, point to take it forward. At the final point I'd like to mention at this point is regarding how far the countries would be willing to join. That we have to wait and watch, and to what extent this approach will gain the legitimacy to deal with many things that have been proposed. To large extent, it would also depend, to my mind, on how many countries actually join in and what is their contribution to trade and this sphere of climate change. I stop at that and look forward to conversations. Thank you.
Oh, those are wonderful comments, Professor Das. In terms of finance, it will, the question is out there now, will this forum, this new climate club or climate alliance be a forum to allocate funds or be supported by a fund for lower, middle and low income countries to finance decarbonization? That maybe relates a little bit also to the question over, will it address subsidies? Whereas, G7 and then OECD countries are subsidizing decarbonization, but which leaves lower middle income countries and low income countries worse off because they don't have the fiscal firepower. The basic question is, one of the major incentives to join such a club financing through G7 and OECD countries? I'm not sure if someone wants to pick up on this question. I have one question from the audience that perhaps relates to this, which from Valeria Cipollone, who asks, how will the Climate Club interact with the work of the Sustainable Finance Working Group of the G20? Is there a difference in mandate and objectives? If any one of the previous speakers feels compelled to perhaps Professor Das, if you have an answer to, or Dr. Maya.
I don't think I have the right answer because if you look at the documents, I can only look at the documents, and I don't think that that much details are already been laid out there. So maybe Robert or Dr. Mayer, whether they would like to respond regarding this.
I mean, I'm happy to come in if I should. I mean, on the Sustainable Finance Working Group, I think the concept there is broader. I think it's a good example where the Climate Club in discussions would also take into account what is done there, but it's not trying to replace what happens in this forum. On the financing, I think it's important to understand this is not an initiative where you start by saying, and we create a fund and we have the objective of this or that amount. I think in the terms of reference, I think did a very good job in bringing that out. It has different objectives. Number one is the question how to mobilize private financing. That's an important aspect. And in discussions, if we find new or innovative approaches, then one could, of course, try to mobilize private sector financing. Second, I think the terms of reference are explicit that they would be very open to bilateral or multilateral mechanisms of support. So the bilateral, just as an example, in Germany, we are having a number of partnerships with countries that we are developing that are very close to the idea of bringing countries, developing emerging market countries forward in their attempts to climate neutrality. And we could, of course, in discussions in the Climate Club, make them understand the concept and then in a bilateral fashion, deepen these discussions if a country would be interested. In most cases, it's a give and take, of course. We provide financing. We ask for ambitious policies on the side of the country. And that could be a very good example. Plus, not excluded at all that we have also multilateral financing. Just as an example, the fund and the World Bank have very good trust funds on capacity building. Very much possible to think, what do they have? In what way could that be an interesting initiative to also support financially to help, especially developing countries, for example, setting the preconditions from the side of administration, from the side of policies to leapfrog into policies that are much more facilitating moving towards climate neutrality. So I think it's a mixture of possibilities, and I think the whole concept is a very flexible one. It doesn't mean that you need to be in the club so that we would have those discussions. In Germany, we have those discussions with many countries that are interested. Now the Climate Club is established, and we would expect that we proceed with those discussions. And if members or if countries feel comfortable that it could make sense to be more intensely part of those discussions, and if they are ambitious in their goals, then of course that's the way we think this club should proceed and grow month by month and year by year.
That's tremendously interesting. Thank you so much, Dr. Maya.
Sorry, David, if I can
please go ahead. Please.
A couple of words to reply to Dr. Kasturi Das on her comment on the mistrust that we see among emerging and developing countries around what advanced countries committed in terms of climate finance, and they didn't deliver yet. And I fully understand that mistrust, and just to point out how we see the Climate Club could add value on that side as well. So this mistrust and these finance targets that haven't been delivered yet are precisely the evidence that the existing institutional architecture is not working the way as is designed. So there are clearly gaps and shortcomings in existing institutions, and those are delaying collective progress. And this is especially true for the finance gap. And so what we see is the Climate Club as a forum where countries can bargain across the different aspects in terms of trade, technology, finance, and industrial transformation. And we see it as a potential successful instrument if it can manage to combine the engagement at the top level, a shared member ambition, the critical mass I was talking about in terms of including also emerging and developing countries, and the focus on the climate agenda, that those aspects altogether are not, they don't exist in the current institutional architecture, and the Climate Club could successfully fill this gap.
All right, thank you very much. We have basically a call for sovereign and private funders to fill the finance gap, if you will. So there's a lot of climate foundations that should be picking up the phone now, perhaps. But we want to move forward to Professor Arnd Cosby, who has written a report with Agora Energiewende on particularly what a climate club shouldn't do. And so I wonder what your view is. You've sort of outlined the do's and don'ts of what climate clubs could potentially do. Is that reflected here? What's your view?
Thanks, David. Yes, I think the overall orientation of what has come out in terms of the terms of reference is more or less in line with what we had proposed, and the main thrust of what we proposed, like the thrust of the report prepared by Dr. Roberta Pierre-Federici and her colleagues at LSE, was inclusiveness and the central criterion of not conceiving of this as a club that has membership benefits and penalties for non-members, and I'll come back to talk about this later in this session. I want to focus on one issue that you've picked up repeatedly in the comments and discussions, and that's whether the club as envisaged could be a forum for discussion of how to go forward on green industrial policy subsidies. I mean, there's certainly a need for a forum that will discuss appropriate behavior in this context, as well as discuss what are the principles and best practices for trade-related instruments like border carbon adjustment. And I think the second pillar of the club as proposed offers the kind of forum in which this could be discussed. And on the subject of subsidies, you know, the burgeoning need is evident. We saw in the U.S. Inflation Reduction Act $5.8 billion in direct subsidies to advanced industrial facilities like steel, aluminum, cement, fertilizers. That's wonderful, but this stuff doesn't happen in an international vacuum. You know, you have great spillover benefits of the same type that China incurred when it heavily subsidized wind and solar power, brought down the levelized cost of energy internationally. That's a wonderful thing. But also recall the spate of renewable energy disputes at the WTO, about over a dozen in my recollection, when we started subsidizing those technologies. You know, and that was a necessary thing. And I support green industrial policy. And furthermore, I think there are ways in which we could effectively use tools like subsidies that are contingent on local content requirements. But there is a reason we agreed at the WTO not to do a local content policy contingency on subsidies. It becomes a subsidies arms race. And there is a concern for those countries that can't compete in that race. Not every country, in fact, the vast majority of countries do not have the fiscal capacity that we see in the US or the EU to undertake those kinds of subsidy outlays. And I'm speaking from Canada as one of those countries. But it goes further than just economic problems. We come to a central problem of the challenge of those kinds of policies in terms of their environmental outcome. If you are putting in place a local content policy and you do it poorly, that is, you don't foster a competitive local domestic supplier of those goods, you have just increased the cost of the dissemination of the environmental technology in question, whether it be electric vehicles or batteries or hydrogen production or renewable energy technologies. So it's not an efficient use of capital. We're talking about negative effects on innovation, dissemination of critically needed green industrial policy goods. So what is needed is an agreement that reflects what we've learned about the successful use of industrial policy over the last decades of practice. And those are more negative lessons than they are positive, I'll grant you that. But the idea is that, for example, we need time-limited application of those kinds of subsidies. They need to be based on objective criteria that are regularly reviewed, and the subsidies are withdrawn when it becomes obvious that if it becomes obvious that they are not really revealing some latent comparative advantage. They need to be targeted at specific market failure. There are a number of things we know about how to do industrial policy, and those could be the basis for agreement in something like a Pillar 2 about how you would do it. All of that true. But let me add at the end, and I've recommended that exactly the agreements like a climate club should come to become a forum for that kind of discussion. But of course, nothing, and this has been said as well, nothing substitutes for agreement within the WTO. It doesn't matter what is agreed at the climate club. It doesn't change the rights and obligations of members of the WTO that may be outside of that club, who still retain the ability to complain about what club members do in terms of their subsidies. So it is one more venue in which to try to foster the kind of international agreement that might eventually migrate to the WTO. That is what would really matter. But we see within the WTO a paralyzed international institution without a functioning dispute settlement mechanism, without the ability to complete multilateral negotiations on new obligations and rights. And moreover, there are existing venues within the WTO, the Committee on Trade and Environment, the sort of quasi-WTO parallel trade and environment structured sustainability discussions, in which we could be discussing these things but aren't. And that's because these kinds of subsidies are land in a context of huge national interest, of the competition to contest the enormous green markets of the future, and moreover the political need for some kind of industrial policy measures as cover for political climate change regulations policies in home, such that they can be promoted. Those challenges, as much as I agree that this kind of discussion is necessary, those challenges are, in my estimation, almost insurmountable.
Thank you so much, Aaron. So we have what I hear from the previous 45 minutes or so, two big themes that could, sort of foster an interest in this very open, very inclusive forum for discussion. And the one is finance, and the other one is a discussion over best practices for OECD subsidies and for the do's and don'ts about subsidies. Can I perhaps gather from the previous speakers a view on this or a reflection on this on Aaron's pitch?
I mean, if I start, to me, Aaron's pitch is one more element where, as he explained very well, what functions in existing fora and what is not functioning at the moment, and having a forum in which you can discuss these topics, that in itself is a helpful element that could transform, and I think Aaron was making that point as well, could transform in then facilitating in those fora where you are talking about the rights and obligations to at some point make progress. And even the climate club, the idea will be setting it up in a way that you, in a certain rhythm, have really high level discussions. And beneath that, you have a more technical level work. Then you do the groundwork that is necessary to have fruitful discussions and maybe make progress on a number of issues. And just to make the main point that the German Chancellor Olaf Scholz had in mind when he initiated this idea early last year, that was exactly seeing, oh, the Europeans were going in the direction of a CBAM. You see this or that, a tariff idea here. Their subsidies are coming up. How is this possible? We're moving in a direction where we can see new trade disputes, and it will be very problematic if you want to be ambitious, if you want to move your industry to climate neutrality, that those different paths, those different policies do not fit together. We need to sit together and discuss. And that's the main element. It's open, it's flexible, it's about cooperation, it's about talking to each other. If you want to put it that way, it's one more element of orderly globalization and aim of going to climate neutrality. And these days, having such a forum, I think, can be tremendously helpful.
Thank you. Professor Das, Roberta, any comments?
Yeah, thank you, David. Just a few comments here. One is that, of course, I agree completely that subsidies are such an area which is very, very controversial, and it has got a lot of implications for policies and domestic politics of each country. So it's good to have more discussion, and if this forum provides a platform for further discussion, that might actually help to have more fruitful discussion and resolve some teething issues. But one point I would like to mention that these, the terms of reference also clearly mention, as has been presented also, that the idea of this G7 proposal on climate club and alliance, whatever you call it, is not to duplicate the efforts. So here, my point is, of course, I understand that if you look at the WTO, there are agreements dealing with subsidies, and not only subsidies related to clean energy, as Aaron pointed out, that we have seen many disputes earlier, but also there are dealings of subsidies related to fossil fuels. So those discussions are there. And of course, I understand that because of the non-working of the dispute settlement system, there is some kind of a void that has been created. But having said that, I think WTO has provision for open plurilaterals also. And there have been some initiatives in terms of open plurilaterals related to this climate as well as sustainable development space. So my question is that in terms of the forum, WTO, to my mind, may provide a better forum to discuss these issues, simply because the number of countries that are already there would be much more than under this initiative. But having said that, going forward, as I mentioned earlier also, how far this particular forum becomes inclusive also depend on how many countries join in there going forward, and what is their contribution to trade as well as this sphere of climate. So at this point, to my mind, I don't see that this forum can replace WTO as the forum for discussing subsidies related thing. But going forward, depending on how the membership of this G7 initiative takes shape, it might be a very good idea to have this discussion. This is entirely my personal view. Thank you.
Wonderful. Thank you.
And hi, David. I'm going to just pick up on Dr. Meyer comment on how countries are currently going in different directions in terms of ways to promote a low carbon transition by implementing CBAMs or subsidies as an example. And this clearly gives us a view on how the nexus between climate policy and trade policy is going to be more predominant in the future. And so we need definitely to successful. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. a successful transition. And so the Climate Club, I see the aspect related to sharing principles and best practices on how to address questions like carbon leakage extremely important, and to actually address also Dr. Kasturida's comment on the need not to replace existing fora like the WTO. The Climate Club is not, as the way we framed in our report, is not meant to replace the WTO fora, rather to promote discussion with and within the WTO fora on those aspects. And there is one specific actually aspect that I think it would be extremely important also in the light of the recently announcement by the European Commission on the CBAM, which is the importance of improving and agreeing on common measurements on the carbon content of complex goods that are traded. And this support will be extremely important, specifically for developing countries which might lack the capability to provide evidence on their carbon content of their goods that are traded, for instance, to the European Union. So I think this is an aspect that the Climate Club could pick up on and perhaps, enhance the discussion around it.
So a number of topics that should gain prominence in the climate and trade nexus, including BCAs, including subsidies, including finance, including standard development and coherence. That sounds all wonderful, fascinating, and very legitimate, given the inclusiveness of the forum. And we, of course, hope that the Japanese G7 presidency will have the same priorities, and that the G20 group will pick up on these wonderful proposals as well. And we're very much hoping that there will be the right necessary political momentum. We want to, given in the interest of time, also address another Climate Club version that has sort of arisen in parallel to the German G7, German finance ministries first, and then G7 proposal, and that has arisen in an entirely different form, spirit, shape than this inclusive and cooperative proposal, namely in the context of 232 national security tariff negotiations between the US and the EU, where negotiators are trying to come to a truce, trying to dismantle these national security tariffs, and the US has made a demand for a global steel and aluminum arrangement addressing carbon intensity and reinstating market orientation. Now, these negotiations are ongoing. We have very recently seen, or not seen, in fact, but there has been a submission from the US to the EU on a membership criteria for such a sectoral steel and aluminum arrangement. There are two technical working groups, one on carbon intensity, one on subsidies and market overcapacity. This setup foresees tariffs to charge imports that are both carbon intense, relatively carbon intense, and do generate overcapacity in the international market. This is an entirely different scheme, and the question here is, this proposal has gained a lot of prominence in the United States, is seen with suspicion in Brussels. The question is, does this transatlantic global steel and aluminum arrangement and these negotiations, would they contradict the spirit of the G7 Climate Club Alliance proposal? What are the caveats of such an arrangement? We've spoken very much in favor just now, or heard many voices in favor of an inclusive, legitimate approach This is seems to be somewhat the opposite. Perhaps I'm wrong. We start in reverse order. Aaron Cosby.
Well, so everything I say has the caveat that we don't yet know what the GSA will look like. And I think there are competing visions of what that finally ends up at. But if you're implying that some of those visions are illegitimate and not inclusive, I would absolutely agree. But let me start with the idea that there is, if we are looking at a tariff-based arrangement, there is a clear distinction between the two initiatives, but it's not necessarily the final destination for this agreement. The text of the agreement that sets this negotiation in motion talks about an obligation to restrict market access. That can be done with tariffs. It can be done with performance standards that are mandatory for compliance at the border. Let me come back to that in a moment. But the distinction between the two initiatives, if we imagine this to be a tariff-based arrangement, that is, if there's a common external tariff between the US and the EU that shuts out market access for those producers that are high GHG intense or that distort markets through overcapacity, then there is a clear distinction between what we see in the G7 Climate Club proposal and what we would see in the GSA. The dividing line, the most important dividing line, and I refer back to previous comments, is that we are talking about a club with penalties to non-members. As soon as you create such a club, then the key challenge is defining what the membership criteria are, because they are very important. Those that are non-members will face penalties. And if that criteria is some measure of ambition, climate ambition, then who gets to decide the metric? Are we talking about, we could be talking about an accounting metric for GHG emissions embodied in goods that are produced. And certainly there would be a need for a metric that defines conditions of market orientation and contributions to market excess capacity. Who gets to define that? That's not a trivial question, because the implications for those that are not present at the table when those metrics are defined are penalties which have very real trade and economic implications. So you're facing a legitimacy problem here. If you're imposing penalties on non-members and the non-members don't have a seat at the table when you decide the criteria for membership on the basis of which penalties are assessed, you have a legitimacy problem. And you probably have a legal problem within the WTO. Depending on the details of the outcome, I would guarantee you have a legal problem within the context of the WTO. For me, a better outcome would be not that vision of where the GSA could go, but something more akin to what we see in the Climate Club proposal, which is not really a club, it's an alliance. And it would be something more akin to a final outcome that agreed to product-based performance standards imposed on domestic production and imposed on import production, which set a maximum limit for the amount of embodied GHG emissions in goods like steel and aluminum, which will be accepted for sale on the domestic market. So you set those standards, you set a trajectory for those standards. You could agree to a trajectory for convergence, because those standards start out being very different, both in terms of the intensity and in terms of the types of even the metrics. But you eventually have a convergence point somewhere down the line. The advantage of an outcome like this, among others, is that the EU does not have to scrap the CBAM innovation in the sectors that are covered. Because to be clear, it is fundamentally inconceivable that the EU would apply the CBAM charges at its border on aluminum, as well as applying charges at its border based on steel and aluminum that has high GHG intensity under the context within the aegis of the GSA. That's inconceivable. But in addition to that benefit, you have a more legitimate form of agreement, one that can countenance different types of climate action, and certainly one that is more, that is arguably WTO legal. Whether that matters or not to some of the participants, I don't know. And in the final event, a more effective agreement, because you're focusing on improvement of standards and not on a punitive instrument that could be used in the context of greater geopolitical rivalries. I guess I'll stop there and wait for the flak to pour in.
that that there's a lot to unpack there. You just mentioned WTO incompatibility of a tariff-based arrangement. You mentioned CBAM incompatibility. You mentioned a lack of legitimacy in terms of, because there's no inclusive process that would inform the development of product-based standards, which would be a better instrument. And there are already 20 developed standards setting instruments or standards for the steel sector out there. So that seems to be, the arrangement itself seems to raise a lot of issues. Would you how would a negotiation then be? You say a product-based carbon intensity standard would be a better instrument rather than tariffs. How would that work? We would apply a product-based standards domestically and at the border, and it's a product standard, and we shut down imports. Is that don't meet the standard? Is that the
Sure, and to be clear, just to avoid confusion, there's this dichotomy within WTO legalese between product standards and PPM-based standards which are based on the process and production method. This would be the latter. It would be not a product standard, but a standard based on how the thing was produced and what the GHG footprint of the good was when it showed up at your border. Yes, it would be imposed on both domestic. It would be a requirement imposed both on domestic producers and imposed on any imported goods as a condition for sale in your market. And to be clear, again, as you say, there are a whole lot of existing international standards and processes to develop more standards of that type in goods, and particularly in the steel sector. And it's not clear where you land in terms of an agreement on a standard like that, and it's not clear that you can find a starting point which would have both the EU and the US agreeing to the same standard at the same, even the same framework standard, much less the same benchmark level of attainment at the outset. But the important thing is that you set in place a process of convergence toward an agreed final point, milestones along that process. That strikes me as a more pragmatic way forward. Not to put my suggestions in the arms of negotiators, but it's an entirely feasible way forward. It's an entirely more desirable outcome to the commitments which have been made to agree to a GSA than a common external tariff type mechanism would be. I think it satisfies the terms of the undertaking that set in place this motion and allows for the removal of the Section 232 tariffs, which we would all like to see.
In fact, the first paper that came out of the Ministry of Finance in Germany set a very strong focus or emphasis on development of common standards for carbon measurement and carbon accounting, which is perhaps the first or an important step to make first before we agree on which products to exclude, and perhaps to have a more inclusive process than just the US and the EU cooking this up behind closed doors. I do wonder what the point of view from Delhi is on this in terms of Delhi. India does have an increasing and a fastly growing steel industry, and that will very much likely be affected by such an arrangement if it ever comes into being. Would you care to comment, Professor Das?
Yeah, thank you, David. I would like to share, as I mentioned, that I don't work with government, but as much I am aware of the general government views on that, as you might be aware, that traditionally government of India is not in favor of combining trade and environment related issues together, and that has traditionally been maintained. And that is one thing. The other is that the government of India has thoroughly been a supporter of multilateral initiatives, be it WTO, be it UNFCCC. But of late, of course, government of India has been getting into more and more regional trade agreements, but not so much into plurilateral ones, and also not in favor of unilateral actions. So that is very, very clear from different statements and the stand taken by the government. So that is something I can share, that what you get to see from the official statements. And yes, I also, coming to my own views, I agree with what Aaron said regarding certain things. For instance, to my mind, this proposal typically looks more like a club explicitly. That is one thing. And this approach of sort of punitive tariff, which is also, not a single tariff, but different rates of tariff, so which raises a lot of questions regarding, as Aaron pointed out, whether they would be WTO compatible or not. But ultimately, devil would lie in the details of the scheme, how they take it forward. In terms of legitimacy, also there is a big question there. Because again, as Aaron pointed out, that who decides and how, which are the countries, on what basis, etc. Those issues come up there in a big way. So I think this is going to be a very controversial thing to my mind going forward. So I stop at that and look forward to other views. Thank you.
It already seems to be a controversial thing, and it will probably remain. Robert, to what extent does this outline of the global steel and aluminum arrangement, as far as we can see it, contradict what we envisage in terms of the inclusiveness of the German G7 proposal?
So I think that the legitimacy of this proposal should be assessed in the specifically dedicated fora, like as mentioned before, the WTO. But to connect this with the Climate Club proposal, I think that the Climate Club could help smooth the implementation of those initiatives by, for instance, helping at least harmonizing standards on carbon accounting. And this is something that I already stressed out earlier. This is specifically important also for developing countries that might lack this type of capability. And I think that working towards harmonization of standards could actually improve the legitimacy itself of these instruments in terms of increasing the acceptance from other countries that are trading with the US and the EU. And in this sense, it might increase also the inclusiveness aspect of these initiatives. So I see the Climate Club as a complementary tool that can help in smooth implementation of other ongoing initiatives.
Thank you. And indeed, there has been, at least in the WTO context, also been an effort now to convene producers, steel producers, aluminum producers, as well as government regulators, to find a way to foster convergence of different standard setting initiatives and different standards. So that seems to be that seems to be the way forward, or hopefully the way forward, rather than the imposition of those top down. I do wonder, of course, since, I mean, the German Chancellery and the German Finance Ministry, as well as the G7 presidency, have certainly been aware of the US initiative and the somewhat competing or somewhat the cognitive dissonance between these two proposals, and I wonder what the view from you is, Dr. Meyer.
So, I mean, first of all, as you know, trade policies of EU countries fall within the competence of the European Union. Therefore, I'm a bit careful, and the European Commission, of course, negotiate the agreements with third countries. Nonetheless, of course, Germany also welcomed the partial lifting of special tariffs and welcomes the ongoing negotiations. I think what is important that under this arrangement, and that's also leading to the difference with the Climate Club, is intended to address carbon intensity, fine, but also the global overcapacity, and that would not be an element that then would picked up in the Climate Club. How this can be done is now under discussion. I think for the German side, what is very important is that the solution is WTO compliant and consistent with relevant other instruments to combat climate change, as you highlighted already, or as especially Aaron highlighted, the CBAM of the EU, and of course then the Climate Club. And I think there it's important to see that the Climate Club is a much broader concept, as it tries to address solutions on different layers, those three pillars. I think the question of standards, the question of certain quota that would allow companies to actually move in the direction of producing, for example, green steel, is the concept that then would be picked up in the Climate Club. And ideally, so to say, the global steel and aluminum agreement could, so to say, feed into the Climate Club and become one of the first successful showcases for one of the sectors that are most needed to tackle the Paris Agreement's goals. So, but very clearly, and everybody knows that the Climate Club is not about putting tariffs. So I think it's a case, if you have something, you have your result, you discuss that, you bring it into the Climate Club, part of it are actually crucial to the Climate Club, and then you could broaden once again those who understand the concept and who move in that direction.
That's fascinating, especially the emphasis on WTO compatibility and CBAM compatibility that we've also heard from the European Parliament and previously the French Council presidency, and as well, I believe, from the German G7 presidency as conditions for such an arrangement. But I wanted to ask Aaron, perhaps for a moment, if you don't mind, on the question of standards. We are looking at two particular scenarios in the steel sector, which is one that would apply carbon intensity standards across technologies, which is electric arc furnace and blast furnaces, and the other, which has now been put forward by the recycling steel makers, the EAF, the electric arc furnace steel makers, is to say we want one carbon intensity standard for both technologies, with the blast furnace, of course, be much more carbon intensive than the EAF. Can you judge those proposals? What they would do in terms of political economy? Like how would we already see fights between producers transatlantically over what kind of standard should be applied?
Let me answer that in three parts. The first is to emphasize that this underscores the importance of who sets the rules. So if you're a U.S. producer, you would like a rule that says, it's technology neutral. You want because you have a lot of clean technology already in play. If you're the European Union or if you're China, you would like a standard which segments by use of technology, because you still have a great deal of blast oxygen furnace technologies in use for steelmaking. So it matters who sets the standard and how that standard is set. Number one. Number two, the importance of that standard. At the end of the day, this is another argument for the idea that you probably won't arrive at an agreement in the first instance, which says we are all going to start in the same place and proceed from there. You need an agreement that countenances different approaches and agrees on points of conversion further down the line. I find it. I don't know how it's possible for the U.S. and the EU to agree on a common standard at the outset. right? And number three, the distinction becomes less important as we go further along. Even in countries like China, which currently does not employ much electric arc furnace production, you will see much more electric arc furnace production coming into play over the next decade as the available stocks of scrap steel become viable for Chinese producers, and because the new investment is going to go toward more efficient production. So over time, that distinction becomes less critically difficult. Again, arguing for the idea of starting at different points and targeting convergence further down the line.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. Roberta, would you or anybody else weigh in on like perhaps one little fact to point out here is to say on the US side, it's been somewhat surprising that there is this proposal, given the fact that the blast furnaces on the US side are unionized, whereas the electric, the much more efficient, carbon efficient steel makers are not unionized. And I wonder what that means politically for the next election if the US is trying to impose a standard for cleaner steel, which would restrict the unionized production. So that's maybe part of the domestic political economy equation that has yet to play out. And I'm not sure if there's similar dynamics on the EU side, but in any case, if we would have final comments on the GSA and the way forward versus the cooperative inclusive climate club, then I would like to ask perhaps Dr. Meyer to start, and we go in that order afterwards.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, I would not repeat myself. I think the GSA and the climate club are different ideas, and they can feed into each other. I agree, and Aaron explained that in a very clear way, how that could feed into the climate club and being very consistent at this point of time. Probably do not have an answer, but I think it's a very good example, because if you start this discussion only between the US and the EU, and Professor Das made that point very clearly, that creates a problem for a number of countries. And then the climate club idea and being there and having this forum as a discussion can actually be very helpful. And maybe as the general comment, the climate club is supposed to kickstart something that has to happen now. I mean, we just cannot afford to wait another years until we finally start, take the example of Germany, to transform the steel industry. It has to start now, and it has to start in steps. And we know in Germany, many of the investments are necessary now over the next couple of years, and these investments have to go in the right technology. And against that background, it's high time to make progress. A lot has been said about standards. If you work with quotas, that could be the initiation of this process. And once it has started, as once again Aaron indicated, once it has started, then you get into the dynamic that we really need and brings us full circle back to the Paris Agreement. Thank you.
Any last comment, Professor Das?
Yeah, thank you. Two comments from my end. One is more general. That is, we can see, as we have been discussing, various initiatives that are coming up. One concern that I would like to flag here is that it should not lead to a situation that we have fragmentation of different forums and, the different approaches. And if there is too much of fragmentation, then ultimately, if we are trying to achieve a better environmental performance and reaching a better climate objective, that should not get hampered. That is one point. The second point I'd like to mention, from India's perspective, again, it's very my personal view. Whatever you talk about, even if you talk about a particular sector, which is like hard to abate sector like steel, you need to be mindful of the fact that on the one hand, there are big players and on the other hand, there are loads and loads of small and medium scale industries that are there. So you cannot think of Indian steel industry as one steel industry which is on the same plane across the board. That is not the case. And here also comes the question that if something comes up which is coming from some other country or some other bilateral initiative, unilateral, or even plurilateral, how far this is going to have impact on the Indian industry would also depend on which segment of the industry we are talking about. So similarly, I think it applies to various other developing and least developed countries, not only India. And I think there is a case for a greater consideration of just transition here. And this is a very important point. And why it is important, because often these countries do not have adequate trade safety net, and similarly for climate related trade measures that is applicable. So just transition is a huge requirement for these countries. So I stop at that. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Roberta, you have the last word.
Thank you. So I think that one of the key words that I've heard during this discussion is the need for creating inclusiveness across all of these initiatives. And I think inclusiveness should be the basis of any initiative that wants to work towards a carbon neutral economy. And so in this respect, I think that the Climate Club, as we already mentioned, should be a forum for discussion, but also a tool that can create the enabling condition for the low carbon transformation to happen in terms of providing finance, technology, and innovation. And I think that these can actually support the implementation of other initiatives that go beyond the Climate Club.
Thank you so much. And with that, we are about 90 seconds towards the end of this event. I thought it was a wonderful discussion, pointing out to our audience the many differences and also similarities between, or potential convergence and synergies between these different two approaches. Thank you so much to our speakers for attending and for speaking at this event in such a busy period, pre-Christmas time period, pre-holiday time period. Thank you so much for being with us, and we hope to see you in some future event at Bruegel. And the same accounts, of course, to the audience. Thank you so much for being with us, and see you next time.
Thanks, David. Cheers.
Thank you very much. Bye-bye.